Hey, well, I've had intake manifold videos in the past, and I wasn't fully satisfied with them because I was always short one of these E1 part number manifolds. So this is the 1982 base manifold. So on the base 1.6 in 1981, this is what you're going to get. This is the 65 horsepower spec manifold. And then we have the E2, which I'm pretty sure I had a video on in the past. Um, but if I did, this video will just replace it, and that will get deleted. And then we have the E3, which is the high output manifold, and we have the E5, which is the 1.9 manifold. You know, the 1.9 carbureted manifold. So each one of these, you can see they have a different intake pattern on them, or I should say, a different carb spacer pattern on them. Now, the bolt pattern is interchangeable between all of these, but the gasket that you use is different. So later, what eventually happened is, you can see they eventually evolved into this pattern, and it is the most basic carb spacer pattern that they went with. Not seeing... Oh, here we go. I see the one I speak of. Bear with me. Oh, it's a reach. Alright, so this is a carb spacer, alright? Now, there is a gasket that goes between the spacer and the carb, and it looks identical to what you see here. But on the flip side, as I flip this over, you can see this is the 1981 pattern. And then the 1982 pattern, it's a little different. Down here, it's just going to be perfectly round, but up here, you still kind of got this kind of thing going here. But you'll tell when you have it, because it'll match this. And these over here, sometimes they'll use this. It really doesn't matter, where it'll be, you know, top of this, and then the bottom is round. But what I end up using for almost all of them, because it's foolproof, and I don't use any... I take it back. On my winter cars, I use the carb heater stuff, but I don't use any of the EGR stuff. And for the summer cars, I don't use the carb heaters. So I usually just resort to using the plain foolproof gasket that's identical to what you see here. We'll go over all these. We'll seal the carb to all these mating surfaces without leaving any vacuum leaks. But it's these two. If you need to be, you know, conscientious about what gasket you're using, depending on the weather you plan on driving. If you plan on driving in the winter, you really need to be matching these two to what you have. Otherwise, you can get away with the plain one for any of these. And then, like I said, these back two, they're pretty lenient on which one you're using. Just, you know, use some common sense. All right, so we'll set down my carb spacer gasket. So that's a big thing up top. Whereas, like I said, the carb pattern for all these is identical, and because of that, the throttle cable hanger for all these is in the identical place, taking the same exact bracket and bolts. The final difference up top that is, you know, actually worth mentioning is the EGR valve. You can see on all the 1.6s they're angled. On the 1.9, it's perfectly perpendicular to the rest of the engine. So we call that the straight one. All these other ones are angled. They also take a different gasket pattern. So when you get a rebuild kit, you know, an entire gasket set for a whole CVH engine, you'll usually get both types of gaskets here, just because then it covers all the bases of the consumer's needs. But now is probably the moment you've been waiting for. We'll take a look at the ports. The undersides of these do vary, but it's honestly nothing to talk about. There you go. We'll stack these all up so you can see them side by side. And then, oops, with the exception of the E1, I have labeled all of these. Let's bust out our marker and carry the torch. We'll touch this up too here. E3. Okay, so We have, to my knowledge, these are the only 4 carbureted intake manifolds. Well, the factory carbureted intake manifolds. If you have a motor sport Ford manifold, it's going to be taking 2 Webers, but these are what you'll find on factory cars. So from left to right, there's no crazy differences. They all share the same intake pattern, but it's the port sizes that change drastically as we take each step forward. Also, you'll see a small difference in the coolant port size for each of these in dimensions. You see for the 1.9, it's a pretty big coolant port. And as we go left, they just get smaller and smaller. What I'd like to know is how much effect that has on engine cooling versus intake manifold heating. I'm curious if the small one heats the manifold less and cools the engine less, and if this other one heats the manifold more and cools the engine more, or maybe it does one and not the other. Anywho, if we're chasing performance, that none of that really matters all that much. What does matter is our port sizes here. So you can see right here on the outlets, there's a pretty drastic change in size for each of these. As we go left to right, you can see them just get bigger and bigger. When we reach the 1.9s, these are huge. If you have a 1.9 engine, this manifold will be a must. Even if you're, say, converting a 1.9 EFI to carburation, this is the manifold you'll be using if you're going to pick out of the factory options. But for a 1.6, things get a little tricky here. If you are moving a whole lot of air, this E5 manifold will be for you, the 1.9 manifold. But you really need to be having high compression pistons. You need to have port work in your head, and you need to have exhaust header. You need a decent cam, a camshaft that will actually flow this much air, and then a carburetor on top that could match. So on top, you'd really want that 3234, or if you can find one somewhere, the 3236. That's going to be out of an entirely different car, like a Toyota or something. If you only want Ford hardware, it's going to be a 3232 or 3234. So that's what you need to know with this big one. If you throw it on any of your 1.6 heads, there is going to be some porting required, unless you're using a turbo head. Those might have the large ports here. But if you have a turbo head, odds are you have the whole rest of the turbo engine. Ergo, you're not going to be using this anyways. But if you have a 1.6, yeah, you got some porting ahead of you just to make that match and line up, let alone making the head flow enough air to benefit from this. If you only make the head match, this will grant you some good top end, but down at the bottom, you'll off idle, you're not going to have as much power as you did with whatever you had started with. You might have a benefit over this base 1.6 at the way left, the 81, but from 82 to 85, one of these two, either of these two are going to outperform this guy for bottom end. So street use, I could roll a dice and be happy with either of these three. But when it comes down to it, this one's useless. This one's not great, and it really just becomes a battle between these two. Do you want something that has really good street ability down from idle to, say, 3,500? Or do you want some good power from $3,000 all the way to redline? It's basically what you need to choose, as well as how far up are we going to build our engine? How much are we going to spend? What kind of work are we going to do? But the port sizes themselves, you can see, are left to right, small to large. I will put dimensions of these in the description, but they don't tell the full story. It's when you look down the ports you can really tell a difference. through here, the number 2 and 3 ports of the 1.9 manifold, you can actually see daylight out of them. So these guys, you know, just stacked on top of the others, you can see this is casted a heck of a lot thicker. Sorry. And not only that, but they're cast slightly more straight to the carb than all these 1.6s. They're a little bit more rounded. I think that just comes from the diameter of the ports. When you make your port big, diameter large enough, eventually, you know, naturally your port just goes from gently curved to a little bit more straight, because you can be a little bit more forgiving. But when we look down the 1.6 high output, you barely see any light down in there. The 82.16, it's even less now. And then when we look down the 81, it's the least. You can see that these are kind of like D-shaped ports. They're real flat at the bottom, pretty round at top, but they're also very small diameter in each direction. The E2 is slightly better. It's not so choked off. The best gauge of measuring is sticking my thumb in there. Stick my thumb. I can move around about 1/4 of an inch from left to right, about 1/8 of an inch up and down. And this E1, it's about 1/4 of an inch left to right, and then a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch up and down. So these aren't as tall on the inside. These two are equally wide, but this one is not as tall. We get to our 1.6 high output. Stick a thumb in there. I got almost 1/4 of an inch up and down. I got like almost like 3/8 side to side. So this one is about the same height as this. So we go from our base, okay, whatever that is. This one is the same width, a little taller. This one is the same height as this, a little wider. And then we get to the behemoth, and well, you can see my thumb doesn't occupy any space at all. It takes 2 of my fingers to occupy some space in that. Those are just big. Now the intake gaskets for all these are the same. That's kind of what, as far as the outside of the port dimensions go, that's what tells the story the best. As I grab a chunk of gasket, these gaskets are made to fit the 1.9s, you know, all the way down to all the 1.6 sizes. So let's set that here. I line up the holes. Simple as that. That's how much relief there is. You know, so the gasket is a bunch bigger than the hole still, even on the 1.9. But you can see how much room there is to spare here. And as I go down on each one of these 1.6s, the room to spare gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, and because these are so long, there's only so much that you can pour out of these if that's what you're really going for. So in these small ones, they're so small diameter, you really struggle getting halfway down the outer tubes. Doing the inner ones are easy, but those are what you want to do last, because what you do on the inners should be based on the outers, because your outers are, they're not most restrictive in the car, but they are most restrictive in your tooling. Your tool can only go around that curve so far, so deep, because the hole you can go through is so small. Versus on the 1.9, if you, for some crazy reason, had to make this thing bigger, you could actually stick your tool more than halfway down from the outside, and then you could even, if you were determined, you could stick it through the other hole, go all the way down and around, and then you could get into this area, flip it over, and by sticking your tool all the way through here, you could do this area as well and actually see some of your progress with a borescope through here. But no, you won't want to do that. This is as big as you can realistically get. If you need bigger than that, you need a different carburetor, and at that point, you'll be looking at a different intake manifold. So these are it. I will share some dimensions in the description of all the ports, so including the coolant passages. Last thing to note is on the back side. I touched on this earlier in the video. It really doesn't concern you unless you have air conditioning, because all these coolant ports they're all for temperature controlled vacuum valves. So they'll look like this, and instead of blue caps, they will be hoses, vacuum lines, going to various vacuum implements within your engine bay. So as these reach certain temperatures, they open and close because it's just the thermal expansion spring system. So then it'll turn your AC on and off depending on the temperature and how it's running. So if you don't have AC, you don't need any of these. But if you have AC, you need to make sure you have enough ports. But these all have the minimum of 3 and the maximum of 4. Otherwise, that's kind of about it. And if you have any questions, comments, let me know.